One day in Paris in the late 1920s, an ignition broke on a Ford Model T. That broken ignition and the events that follow would change the way that individuals in societies viewed themselves and their relationship to others. You've definitely thought, read, or even said something because of that broken Model T Ford ignition. Curious to know why? Well, stick around for today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, episode 326, Gertrude Stein's Model T. This is John Paulus, host of Life's Potluck Buffet. If you are enjoying the show, please subscribe. If you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And if you have a Brave browser, you can now contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you, as always, for listening. In the 1860s, a French lexicographer and author of a famous dictionary in French, whose last name was Littré, which sounds like lettered, which I think should qualify as an aptronym. You know, those names that your profession is the same as your last name. So if you're a baker, a professional baker, and your last name is Baker, that's an aptronym. So I feel like this whole Littré thing, I'm going to count that. Okay. So Littré came up with an idea for a definition of generation that would embrace all of the people in society who were born in the same span of years, and not just the individuals or families born at a certain time. So this is where the modern version of social generations comes up. There were ancient and mostly mythological versions of social generations, for sure. In the long distant past, human beings wrote poems and talked about and thought of these long lost generations that they associated with various qualities and so forth. But it wasn't until the 19th century that the kind of social version for everyday people who were alive came about. And it's important that this came about in France because it really caught on, and it became a very popular idea in France. So much so that somewhere in the late 1920s, when Gertrude Stein's Model T Ford had a bad ignition and she had to get it repaired in Paris, and the mechanic who seemed to be not attending to it in a way that the owner of the garage liked, was determined by the owner of that garage to be part of a lost generation, a génération perdue, which referred to the generation of 1914, the people who had experienced the upheavals of the Great War in Europe, and who had then come of age in that context and in the context of the Roaring Twenties that followed the Great War. If you're not familiar with Gertrude Stein, Stein was an American expatriate in Paris whose literary and artistic circles defined a generation of American authors and Western European artists, including Ernest Hemingway and Pablo Picasso and many others. And it was Hemingway who tells us this story about Gertrude Stein and says that Stein then turned to him and said, "That's you. You're all a lost generation." Hemingway, too, like the car mechanic in Paris, experienced the horrors of the First World War and was part of that same generation in French thinking. And now in the thinking of the great literary mind, Gertrude Stein, which transported a French approach to social generations to an English language audience through Hemingway. Oh, I should mention, we also have something to thank Gertrude Stein for, and that's the phrase, "there's no there," which we use all the time, and it's become part of our just everyday speech in many ways. And maybe you said it today, but when you say there's no there, you're actually making a reference to Gertrude Stein, who was writing about when she tried to kind of, in her memory, to where she grew up, Oakland, California. And she realized that despite all of her nostalgic hopes, she couldn't get there. And there was really no there. Well, there. So we use it in a slightly different way, but just to let you know, it's a kind of cool fact. Thanks to Gertrude Stein. But it wasn't Gertrude Stein or Ernest Hemingway or anybody related to the Lost Generation who had come up with the idea of a broad generational theory, especially of the United States, that would explain United States history through the pop psychology of generational cycles and archetypes. That was William Strauss and Neil Howe, who wrote a book about United States history through the lens of these archetypes of generations that we're now so familiar with, that they'd devised to explain changes and shifts and so forth every 25 years or so. And the theory that grew out of the pop psychology, American history writings of Strauss and Howe is called the Strauss-Howe generational theory. And this is what we have to thank for the popularization of categorizing groups of generations by their birth cohorts of about 25 years. And those terms, some of them existed already. So, for example, the GI generation, which is the generation of people who were involved in and came of age in World War II, and who the men and women who operated in that context. That is sometimes called the greatest generation. That was another term that then got used for that generation. The term greatest generation dates back to as early as 1953 with the U.S. Army general referring to the people who fought in World War II and the Korean War. And the GI generation actually first referred to Chicanos in an article written in the early 1970s about Chicanos who had served as soldiers in World War II. So some of these names, like the Lost Generation, have older references, but the Strauss-Howe generational theory is where they became concretized. And Strauss and Howe also created names for other generations, like millennials. And for Gen X, which is the generation before millennials and after baby boomers, for Gen X, they called it in their book the 13th generation. Because remember, they're trying to do the history of the U.S. by generation, and so by their countings, Gen X is the 13th generation, and the idea about baby boomers came from publications in the media as early as 1951 in the U.S., but referring to the large number of babies born after World War II. But it became solidified when those same babies started going to college in the 60s, and then finally in the early 70s when it became a common term for people born after the Second World War. Interestingly, Gen X was first used by a very famous photographer in the 1950s to refer to groups of people at that time who were coming into adulthood. But when Strauss and Howe were publishing their book in 1991, there was another book that came out that was a novel referring to the Generation X as the group that it now kind of represents, and it then became a popular term for that group that Strauss and Howe would call the 13th generation. And we have Gen Z and Gen Alpha, because once you run out of letters in the Latin alphabet, you have to go to the Greek alphabet because that's what got decided that would happen. So there's that. But the history that they wrote goes up to 2069. So that's also very interesting, it must be said. Now, generational theory has its ups and downs. And one of the downsides is that you can't really account for a kind of archetypal persona of a generation, because that's never going to be able to reach the level of internal consistency or predictability that, well, say something scientific would have. Let me give you an example to explain. The silent generation is used for people who were born in the United States from, say, 1925 to 1945, 1928 to 1945, somewhere in that range. Now, here's the issue with the generational label and with the persona model. You have the kind of traditional interpretation of the silent generation is that silent generation people are traditionalists. But the fact of the matter is that the silent generation people were the leaders of the 1960s countercultural movements in the United States. And so that is a kind of direct opposite of a traditionalist. And so when you think about how the generational categories seem to embrace both a group that, yes, may be certifiably traditionalist, but also certifiably countercultural, which is anti-traditionalist, it kind of sounds like there's not a lot of, well, as Gertrude Stein would say, there. From a certain perspective, it's kind of like astrological signs or the Myers-Briggs personality test, which, oh, by the way, is based on Jungian archetypes that mother and a daughter, Myers and Briggs, came up with. And so that is also interesting because there you have the same kind of lumping groups of people into in and out groups, and so you can relate to people in that same group, or or feel like you have differences with people in the out group because they're not part of your in group, and that's a very human thing to do. But I think the lesson of today is to not think of these generational categories as anything deterministic in reality, but people can and have and probably will continue to believe in their deterministic nature and the validity of these generational boundaries. Well, let's ask the cards for what they have to say about our work and life. So, you ready, cards? Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us some things. No, it's when it comes to life, we are all Dali. Well, there's a card to break this whole game. So Salvador Dali, the famously mustachioed, I'll just say artist right now, even though he thought of himself as a lot more than an artist. And I just feel like this is just the perfect card for today. So thank you, cards. This is exactly an example of what I'm talking about. So in January 1957, Salvador Dali appeared on What's My Line, which is a game show where people had to guess people's occupations. And there's a special segment called the Mystery Challenger where the panelists are blindfolded because they would recognize who it is. And obviously they would have recognized Salvador Dali. And then they have to ask that celebrity questions. They're blindfolded. They ask the celebrity who's not blindfolded questions about their occupation to find out which celebrity it is. Well, what is Salvador Dali's occupation? Now, his ability to say yes to questions like, was he an athlete? Did he make drawings like comic strips for a living? Was he a writer? Caused amused confusion among the panelists and a great deal of hilarity in the live audience. And now, in thinking about ourselves and our lives, especially in relationship to what generation we are part of, let's be like Dali in this case and think about the richness of our lives and understand that we can find liberation in the fact that who we are is not determined by what generation we were born into. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time on Life's Potluck Buffet. Oh, I forgot. Gertrude Stein loved Salvador Dali's mustache. She said a lot of things about it. Huh. I'm impressed, Cards. That was great.